It's time to talk about negative gearing. This was a feature of the 2019 election campaign and Labor lost that election. Now it has been modelled, at least reportedly, by Treasury. Does that mean the government is going to go down that path? Absolutely not. But let's talk about its merits or otherwise. Joining me now is independent economist Saul Eslake. Saul, thanks so much for your time. This is politically difficult, but let's talk about the economics of it. What do you think should be done with negative gearing?
What I've advocated for years, for longer than Max Chandler Mather has been alive, for example, is that negative gearing should be curtailed, in particular by denying it for new investors in established housing, whilst leaving it there for people who want to invest in new housing, which does add to the supply of housing, as we desperately need to do, grandfathering it so that people who entered into negatively geared arrangements in good faith under the law as it has been were not retrospectively penalised, but also reducing the capital gains tax discount, which currently means that you only pay tax on half the capital gain you make, to, say, 33%, or as Labor proposed at the 2016 and 2019 elections, 25%. I wouldn't necessarily go as far as Labor was proposing then, but certainly curtailing it for people who invest in established housing, as about 70% of investors currently do. That doesn't add to the supply of rental housing, or to the extent that it does so by creating demand for rental housing, by outbidding people who'd otherwise be buying that housing to live in themselves. So there'd be no impact on rents from abolishing negative gearing prospectively for people buying established housing, whilst you retain an incentive to invest in new housing, which, as I say, we need to do. I think they are proposals that would be politically saleable, especially if they're put by an incumbent government who have all the vastly superior resources that incumbent governments have behind them, rather than being put by an opposition, as they were in 2016 and 2019, and having all the resources that governments have being used to mount an almighty scare campaign, as the coalition did in 2019.
Yeah, that's right. Look, and I think you'd need to seek a mandate to do this because the change would be material. So we're talking about it at the right time, Saul. But so what you're saying is the material effect. What is the material effect of changing capital gains and negative gearing, as you've just outlaid there? It would mean that people would be more likely to sell their home and move into more suitable accommodation, as they get later in life?
Not necessarily, although that's possible, but I'm not asserting that as a big part of the argument. Rather, what I'm suggesting is that it's become increasingly common, especially since the change to the capital gains tax regime in 1999, for people wanting to buy their first home to find themselves facing competition from investors who get their interest costs subsidised by being able to deduct them not only against the rental income which they will earn if they buy the property and rent it out, but also if the interest expense exceeds their rental income, they can offset it against their other wage and salary income in order to reduce the amount of tax they pay. People buying a home for themselves can't do that. And so what's happened since 1999 in particular is that we've now got over 20% of Australians owning at least one rental property. That's an extraordinarily high proportion by international standards, and they are part of the reason, not the whole reason, not even necessarily the most important reason, but one reason why the home ownership rate among people aged under 45 is now back to where it was in the 1950s.
Yeah, that's right. And also, do you see the effect of the housing crisis at the moment? Perhaps some of these policies that we're talking about is that young people can't get into a home. They're very lifestyle driven. They don't want to just buy a home in an area that they don't want to live. So perhaps those young people are saying, well, I'm not going to buy a house to live in, but I'm going to buy an investment property. So it keeps on, this kind of train keeps on expanding on itself.
Well, there are some young people who are undoubtedly doing that, and it works for them in part because the interest that they pay on the loans they take out to buy an investment property is tax deductible. Whereas if you take out a loan, as almost everyone does, to buy a home in which you intend to live in yourself, the interest is not tax deductible, nor, of course, is the capital gain when you sell it taxable, as it is in the case of an investment. But most people who are buying a home of their own are usually thinking about it as a place where they want to live, where if they plan to start a family, they intend to raise them, rather than viewing it solely as an investment proposition, which, of course, investors in housing do.
So do you think property prices will just keep on going up in Australia, or is there a view that there might be a crash?
Well, if we keep doing what we've been doing for the last 60 years, which is needlessly inflating the demand for housing by throwing cash at people, enabling them to spend more on housing than they otherwise would do, which is the effect of first homeowners grants, stamp duty concessions, mortgage deposit guarantee schemes, shared equity schemes, and would be the effect of super for housing if that were ever legislated. If we keep doing that, and if we also keep restricting the supply of housing by excessively onerous zoning and planning laws, and by imposing ever-rising taxes and charges on people who are building new homes, if we keep doing dumb things, we're going to get perverse results, which is increasingly expensive housing. The problem, Laura, I suspect, is that, although they don't say it, politicians know that in any given year there are about 100,000 people who succeed in becoming first home buyers. And even if you assume for everyone that does, there are 5 or 6 who don't, that's maybe 700,000 votes for policies that would restrain the rate of house price inflation. Whereas politicians also know that at any point in time there are at least 11 million Australians who own their own home. There are at least 2 million who own at least one investment property. That's somewhere between 11 and 13 million votes for policies that would keep house prices going up at the sort of rates they have done over the last 30 years. Even the dumbest of our politicians can do that math, and they do.
Yeah, they do indeed. The dumb policies and the base politics. Saul, great to talk to you today.
Thank you very much for having me on.